Every human being alive today is, genetically speaking, incredibly young. But one group on Earth carries DNA that tells a far older story than anyone else's, and the reason why has nothing to do with what you'd expect. To understand this story, you have to let go of an idea that most of us grew up with. The idea that humanity is divided into a handful of distinct races, each with its own separate genetic identity, each traceable back to its own separate root. That idea feels intuitive. It matches what we see on the surface: skin color, hair texture, facial structure. But when geneticists actually opened up the human genome and started comparing populations across every continent, they found something that upended that entire picture. What they found wasn't a family tree with several ancient separate branches. What they found was closer to a single trunk, still mostly intact, with one small twig that broke off relatively recently and spread across the rest of the planet. That twig is every non-African population on Earth. And the trunk, the deep, ancient, still branching root system of human genetic diversity, is Africa. This is where the story gets strange, and where the science becomes genuinely fascinating rather than the simplified, headline-friendly version you might have heard. Geneticists don't measure the age of a population's DNA the way you'd measure the age of a person, or a fossil, or a rock. Every human being alive today, no matter where their ancestors lived, carries a lineage that stretches back the same number of generations to our shared common ancestors. Well, nobody's DNA is older in that sense. What differs, and differs dramatically, is genetic diversity. How many different genetic variants exist within a population? How many distinct lineages, distinct mutations, distinct evolutionary threads are still present and detectable in the DNA of people living today? And on that measure, one region of the world stands far above every other. Sub-Saharan Africa contains more human genetic diversity than the rest of the entire planet combined, not slightly more. Dramatically, overwhelmingly more. Two people randomly selected from two different villages in, say, modern Nigeria and Kenya can be more genetically different from each other than a randomly selected person from Norway is from a randomly selected person from Japan. That single fact, once it's fully absorbed, quietly dismantles the whole idea of a small number of neatly separated human races. The deepest, oldest, most varied branches of the human genetic tree aren't spread evenly around the globe. They're concentrated in one place, and everyone outside of that place is, genetically, a much more recent and much more narrow slice of humanity. So how did scientists figure this out, and why does it matter? The story really begins in the 1980s and 1990s with an Italian population geneticist named Luca Cavalli Sforza. Cavalli Sforza spent decades of his career doing something almost nobody else was doing at the time. He traveled the world, collecting blood samples from hundreds of human populations, from remote villages in Papua New Guinea to nomadic groups in the Kalahari, to isolated communities in the Caucasus Mountains. He wanted to build a genetic map of humanity, tracing not skin color or bone structure, but the actual patterns of shared and unshared DNA between groups. In 1994, he published a landmark book called The History and Geography of Human Genes, a work that took the raw material of human genetic variation and used it to reconstruct, with startling clarity, the pathways along which our species had spread across the planet. What Cavalli Sforza's data showed, and what every major study since has confirmed and refined, is that genetic diversity decreases the farther you get from East Africa, in a smooth, predictable gradient. This is sometimes called the serial founder effect, and once you understand how it works, the whole picture snaps into focus. Imagine a large, diverse population living in one region. Now imagine a small group breaks off from that population and migrates somewhere new. That small group, by pure chance, only carries a fraction of the genetic variation present in the larger population they left behind. They didn't take a full random sample of every gene variant that existed back home. They took whatever variation happened to exist within their specific small group. Now imagine, generations later, an even smaller group breaks off from that new population and migrates even farther. Once again, they only carry a subset of the diversity that existed in the group they left. Repeat this process again and again across tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles, and you get exactly the pattern scientists observe today. A steady, cumulative loss of genetic diversity the farther a population's ancestors traveled from the original human homeland in Africa. This is why populations in the Americas, the last continents that humans reached, show the lowest levels of genetic diversity of any region on Earth. It's not because anything is wrong with their DNA, and it's certainly not because their ancestors are somehow less evolved or less developed. It's simply the mathematical consequence of a long chain of small founding groups, each one carrying forward only a portion of the diversity of the group before it, like photocopies of photocopies, each one losing a little more of the fine detail without losing any of the essential humanity underneath. Now let's talk about the migration itself, because this is where the science becomes something closer to an adventure story. The most widely supported model, backed by decades of genetic, archaeological, and fossil evidence, holds that anatomically modern humans, people who looked essentially like us, evolved in Africa somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. For an enormous stretch of time after that, tens of thousands of years, our species lived exclusively on that one continent, spreading, mixing, diversifying, forming, and dissolving different populations across an incredibly varied landscape of deserts, savannas, forests, and coastlines. This is why African genetic diversity runs so deep. It had far more time to accumulate, and it accumulated across a much larger and more varied set of ancestral populations than anywhere else humans would eventually live, spread across an enormous range of environments, from dense equatorial rainforest to open savanna to arid coastline, each shaping local populations in slightly different ways over tens of thousands of years. Then, sometime around 60,000 years ago, give or take tens of thousands of years depending on which evidence you weigh most heavily, a relatively small group of humans left Africa and began the migration that would eventually populate every other continent on the planet. We're not talking about a mass exodus. Genetic evidence suggests this founding group may have numbered only in the low thousands, possibly even fewer, a small, fragile population carrying with them only a slice of the genetic diversity that existed back home, stepping out into an unfamiliar world. From that point, the expansion was staggering in scope. Descendants of that original migrating group spread east along the coastlines of Asia, eventually reaching Australia by boat tens of thousands of years before most other seafaring technology existed anywhere else in the world. Other descendants pushed north and west into the Middle East and eventually into Europe. Others moved deeper into Central Asia, then across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, becoming, remarkably, the very last major landmass our species would settle. Every single one of these expanding groups experienced the same repeated pattern. Small founding populations splitting off from larger ones, carrying forward only a portion of the genetic diversity of their parent group, then splitting again and again and again. This is the real answer to the question buried inside that provocative, clickbait framing you may have seen online. The idea that scientists have somehow ranked human races by the age of their DNA. That framing gets the science backwards, and it smuggles in the false idea that biologically distinct races even exist as separate ranked categories in the first place. They don't. What actually exists is a single, continuous, deeply interconnected human genetic story, one that traces back to a common origin in Africa, and one where every population alive today, without exception, descends from that same African lineage. The real evidence-based finding isn't that some populations are older than others. It's that African populations retain more of the original depth and breadth of that ancient genetic diversity, while every population outside Africa carries a narrower, more recently derived slice of it. In 2019, this picture was reinforced dramatically by one of the largest studies of human genetic diversity ever conducted. Researchers analyzed DNA samples from well over 250,000 people, drawn from populations across every inhabited continent, using advanced sequencing techniques that could detect far more subtle genetic variation than earlier studies were capable of measuring. The results confirmed in exhaustive detail exactly what Cavalli Sforza's pioneering fieldwork had suggested decades earlier. African populations showed the highest levels of genetic diversity of any region studied by a wide margin, and that diversity wasn't evenly distributed even within Africa itself. Populations in parts of southern and eastern Africa, home to some of the oldest continuously inhabited regions by modern humans, showed particularly deep and distinct genetic lineages, some tracing back further than any other human lineage yet identified. One especially striking example involves the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, including groups like the San, sometimes referred to as Bushmen in older anthropological literature, though many communities today prefer their specific group names. Genetic studies have repeatedly found that Khoisan populations carry some of the deepest, most ancient branches of the entire human genetic tree, branches that split off from the ancestors of all other living humans, including other African populations, tens of thousands of years earlier than most other known divergences. In a real sense, if you were looking for the population on Earth whose DNA connects most directly to the deepest roots of our species, groups like the Khoisan would be very near the top of that list. Not because their biology is somehow more primitive, an idea that is both scientifically false and historically tied to deeply harmful colonial-era pseudoscience, but because their ancestors remained in place, continuing to accumulate and preserve genetic diversity, while other populations underwent the repeated narrowing bottlenecks of migration. This point deserves real emphasis, because it's exactly where the popular, sensationalized version of this story tends to go wrong. Having deeper, older, more diverse genetic roots doesn't mean a population is more evolved, more advanced, or biologically superior in any sense. Evolution isn't a race with a finish line, and genetic diversity isn't a scoreboard. It simply reflects population history how long a group has lived in a particular region, how large and stable that population has been, and how many times, or how few times, their ancestors experienced the population bottlenecks that come with migrating into new, unfamiliar territory. Every population on Earth today is the product of a successful, unbroken chain of survival stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. There's no meaningful sense in which any of them are lesser or lower or less developed than any other. So why does any of this actually matter, beyond correcting a viral video title? It matters enormously for medicine, for one thing. Because African populations carry the greatest reservoir of human genetic diversity, they also carry genetic variants that are underrepresented or entirely missing from the genetic databases scientists have historically relied on to study disease risk, drug metabolism, and hereditary conditions. For decades, the vast majority of genomic research was conducted using samples drawn overwhelmingly from populations of European ancestry, simply because that's where much of the early infrastructure and funding for genetic research happened to be concentrated. That historical imbalance means that many genetic tools built for things like disease risk prediction work less accurately, sometimes significantly less accurately, when applied to people of African ancestry, not because of any biological deficiency, but because the underlying reference data was incomplete from the start. Recognizing the depth of African genetic diversity isn't just an academic curiosity. It's a direct, practical argument for why global genomic research needs to include far more African populations, and why doing so would likely reveal disease-related genetic variants that remain completely invisible in current, narrower datasets. It also matters for how we think about the concept of race itself. Modern population genetics has made it clear, again and again across study after study, that the traditional categories many societies have used to sort people into distinct races don't line up with the actual patterns of human genetic variation. There is more genetic difference within what's commonly labeled a single racial group than there often is between different racial groups. Traits like skin color, which historically served as the primary visual marker for dividing humanity into races, are controlled by a relatively small number of genes that responded to a very specific evolutionary pressure, the amount of ultraviolet radiation in a given region. And they can shift relatively quickly on an evolutionary timescale without dragging the rest of a population's genome along with them. In other words, skin color evolves somewhat independently from the vast majority of the genetic variation that actually matters for understanding human ancestry and relatedness. Two populations can have very similar skin tones, while being genetically quite distant from each other, and two populations with very different skin tones can be genetically much closer than their appearance would suggest. There's another layer to this story that adds even more texture, and it involves a discovery that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago, the recovery of actual ancient DNA from fossilized human remains. In the 2000s and 2010s, researchers successfully sequenced genetic material from Neanderthal fossils, and later from an entirely separate, previously unknown group called the Denisovans, identified initially from a single fingerbone fragment found in a Siberian cave. What they discovered reshaped the human family tree yet again. Modern humans whose ancestors left Africa carry small but measurable amounts of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, typically between 1 and 2%. The genetic legacy of interbreeding that occurred as early modern humans encountered Neanderthal populations already living across Europe and parts of Asia. Populations in parts of Oceania, including groups in Papua New Guinea and Australia, carry Denisovan DNA as well, sometimes several percent of their total genome, evidence of a separate encounter between modern humans and this more mysterious archaic group. Interestingly, populations whose ancestors never left Africa generally carry little to none of this archaic DNA, simply because their ancestors never crossed paths with Neanderthals or Denisovans in the first place, those encounters having occurred after modern humans expanded beyond the continent. This adds one more layer of complexity to any simplistic idea of ranking populations by genetic age or purity. Every population's genome is its own unique mosaic, shaped by a distinct combination of ancient African diversity, the specific bottlenecks of its migratory history, and in many cases, small contributions from entirely different, now extinct human species that our ancestors briefly overlapped and interbred with along the way. Taken together, all of this evidence points toward a much richer, much more accurate, and honestly far more compelling story than the one suggested by a headline promising a simple ranking of races. The real story is one of a single origin, a long, slow accumulation of diversity across an enormous and varied African continent, followed by a series of dramatic, repeated departures, each one carrying a smaller sample of that diversity out into new and unfamiliar environments, all the way to the most remote corners of the globe. It's a story about resilience, about small groups of humans surviving extraordinary journeys across deserts, mountain ranges, and open ocean, carrying with them just enough genetic material to eventually give rise to every culture, every nation and every population alive on Earth today. It's also, in its own way, a deeply unifying story, even though it gets twisted again and again into something divisive by headlines chasing clicks rather than accuracy. Every human being alive today shares the same deep African root. Every population's family tree eventually converges on the same ancestral branches. Populations that lived in Africa many tens of thousands of years before anyone's ancestors set foot anywhere else. The genetic differences we can measure between populations today, real and scientifically meaningful as they are for things like medical research and studies of human history, are differences in degree, not differences in kind. They're the traceable fingerprints of migration, not evidence of separate origins, and certainly not evidence of any hierarchy. There's a historical dimension to this story that's worth sitting with for a moment, because the idea of ranking human populations by some biological measure isn't new, and it isn't harmless. Long before modern genetics existed, scientists in the 18th and 19th centuries were already trying to sort humanity into fixed racial categories, ranked by supposed levels of civilization, intelligence, or biological development. That era produced skull measurements, invented hierarchies, and pseudoscientific frameworks that were later used to justify colonialism, forced labor, and some of the darkest chapters in modern history. When a viral video today promises to reveal which race has the oldest or most impressive DNA, it's tapping into that same old instinct, the desire to reduce something as vast and complicated as human ancestry into a simple, ranked list with winners and losers. Modern genetics doesn't support that instinct. If anything, every major genomic study conducted over the past 3 decades has moved in the opposite direction, dismantling old racial categories piece by piece and replacing them with a much more accurate picture of gradual, overlapping, continuously varying human diversity. This matters just as much in forensic science and consumer ancestry testing, 2 fields where the public most often encounters genetic information directly. When a popular ancestry testing company tells a customer they're a certain percentage Scandinavian or East Asian or West African, they're not measuring some fixed, essential racial identity buried in that person's cells. They're comparing that person's genetic markers against reference panels built from modern populations living in specific regions today, and estimating which regions their ancestors most likely lived in a few hundred years ago. It's a statistical estimate built from limited comparison groups, not a discovery of some hidden biological truth about race. The categories those companies use are drawn along national and regional lines, because that's useful and intuitive for customers, not because those categories reflect neat, distinct genetic clusters that exist in nature. 2 people from neighboring villages, separated by nothing more than a river or a mountain range, can sometimes show more genetic difference from each other than 2 people separated by an entire ocean, depending on the specific migratory history of their ancestors. Understanding this also changes how we should think about the word diversity itself when it comes to genetics. In everyday conversation, diversity often gets used as shorthand for visible differences in appearance, language, or culture. But genetic diversity, in the scientific sense, is something quieter and less visible, hidden away in the sequence of base pairs inside every cell. A population can look relatively uniform on the outside while carrying enormous internal genetic variation. And a population can look highly varied in appearance while actually sharing a narrower genetic base. This is part of why the discovery of Africa's extraordinary genetic diversity was so significant when it first became clear through large-scale sequencing projects. It wasn't visible on the surface in the way people expected. It had to be uncovered by actually reading the genome itself, base pair by base pair, across thousands of individuals, a task that would have been technologically impossible before the era of modern high-throughput sequencing. None of this is meant to suggest that genetics is unimportant, or that studying population-level genetic differences is somehow off-limits or taboo. Quite the opposite. Understanding how genetic diversity is distributed across human populations is essential for medicine, for public health, for understanding the deep history of our species, and for correcting the real documented gaps in scientific research that have historically underrepresented certain populations. The problem was never studying human genetic variation. The problem is the specific, misleading framing that turns a fascinating and genuinely important scientific story into a simplistic, ranked competition between invented racial categories dressed up with dramatic music and a clickable title. The actual research, done carefully and reported accurately, tells a story that's arguably far more interesting than the exaggerated version, because it's true, because it's supported by mountains of converging evidence from genetics, archaeology, linguistics, and the fossil record, and because it reveals something genuinely moving about where every single one of us ultimately comes from. There's also a forward-looking side to this story because the scientific effort to properly map human genetic diversity is still very much underway. In recent years, researchers have launched large-scale projects specifically designed to sequence genomes from populations across the African continent that had been badly underrepresented in earlier genomic databases, initiatives bringing together scientists from dozens of African nations to build reference datasets that actually reflect the true depth of human genetic variation found there. Early results from these efforts have already turned up thousands of previously undocumented genetic variants, some of them potentially significant for understanding disease risk, drug response, and human evolutionary history more broadly. Every one of these newly cataloged variants adds another small piece to the puzzle, another thread in that ancient tapestry of African genetic diversity that so much of the rest of the world's genome descended from. Scientists studying this data aren't looking for a ranking. They're looking for a more complete and more honest picture of the full range of human genetic variation, most of which, it turns out, has been sitting right where our species began, waiting for the tools to finally catch up and reveal it in full detail. It's worth pausing on just how recent all of this understanding actually is. The technology to sequence a full human genome quickly and affordably has really only existed for the past 15 to 20 years. Before that, scientists were working with much smaller, much cruder genetic markers, and entire theories about human ancestry and racial classification were built on comparatively thin evidence. The explosion of full genome sequencing changed everything almost overnight, allowing researchers to compare not just a handful of genetic markers between populations, but millions of individual data points across the entire genome. That's part of why this picture of deep African diversity and a relatively recent narrow migration out of the continent has become so firmly established in such a short period of time. It isn't a fringe theory or a single controversial study. It's the overwhelming consensus that has emerged from dozens of independent research teams, using different methods, different populations, and different statistical approaches, all converging again and again on the same fundamental story. So the next time you come across a headline promising a shocking ranking of human races by DNA age, it's worth remembering what the actual science says. There is no ranking, there is no hierarchy. There's a single human story written across every genome on the planet, with its deepest, oldest, most varied chapters preserved in the populations of Africa, and its more recent chapters unfolding across every continent our ancestors eventually reached. The real shock isn't that one group's DNA turned out to be older than everyone assumed. The real shock is how completely modern genetics has dismantled the very idea we all grew up believing, that humanity was ever cleanly divided into separate races in the first place. What the evidence actually reveals is something far more remarkable than any viral ranking could ever offer. It reveals a species that spread from a single African cradle to every corner of the earth, across ice ages, deserts, mountain ranges, and open ocean, carrying an unbroken thread of shared ancestry the entire way. It reveals that the very traits so many cultures have used for centuries to divide people into rigid categories, skin tone, facial features, hair texture, are a thin, recent, surface-level layer sitting on top of a much older, much deeper, and thoroughly shared genetic foundation. And it reveals that the population holding the richest, most ancient record of that foundation isn't some distant abstraction. It's still here, still living, still carrying forward a genetic legacy tens of thousands of years deep in communities across the African continent today. That thread still runs quietly and completely through every single one of us, no matter where on earth our own particular story happened to lead.